Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 33 from book 4 of De Bello Gallico. So just to refresh where we are, we're still talking about the invasion of Britain, right? And Caesar has been stuck in Britain without being able to get back. He's been rebuilding his ships, refitting his ships to try to get back across the English Channel. But the most recent turn of events has been sort of that turn of the British tribes against him. So he had made a peace treaty, but he got the sense, according to him, right, in the last chapter, he suspected rather, that they were going to turn on him. And they have. So now we've got this moment where the Romans are being openly attacked by the British. They're not fighting in sort of a set battle, though, which Caesar's described before. Instead, he says that their intention is to sort of pick off the Romans and starve them out. So in this chapter, you're not really advancing the plot so much, but I still think it's an interesting one, only because it's a very culturally based chapter. So you're going to see how the British fight, and Caesar's description of them is really fascinating, right? And we'll talk about why he even bothers to take this pause and explain it. But he does a great job of showing you sort of the British method of fighting with their war chariots. Now, before we dive into the translation, what I always tell you in these videos is the first thing you want to do is make sure you have the vocab under control. So there's a lot of vocab lists you could find out there, for De Bello Gallico. Just pick one that gives all the words you need, memorize the words, and then go from there. It's really hard to read and understand if you don't know what the words mean. So it's sort of a non-starter. You need to know the vocab before you progress too far into it. The second thing I'd encourage you to do, read this aloud, right? Bring it to life, bring the language to life. If you're working in class, you can always read this aloud to a partner, right? A classmate, practice your speaking, your pronunciation, have them read it back to you, and now you get to work on your listening skills. This will all come together and just help you read the Latin instead of just translating in your head. You can do that, of course, but it's much better to actually learn and use the language by speaking it, listening to it, and not shutting off those parts of your brain. Okay. My last bit of advice that I say in all these videos is use the read and reread method. So if you haven't tried this before, read through the story, write down any problem areas that you have as you go through this chapter. It could be vocab, it could be grammar, sentences, whatever it is. When you get to the end, look at your list, right, and try to figure out where you went wrong. The vocab is really easy. You just go back and you highlight the words you're struggling with and really memorize them. If it's grammar, you can look at a commentary, right? There's a lot out there that'll kind of walk you through it, or you can try it on your own. But one way or another, you want to shore up the grammar mistakes you're making. Then go back and read this chapter again, right? Read through it a second, third, fourth time, as many times as you need to. And eventually you should hit a point where you're able to read through this without any vocab help, without needing to look at a grammar commentary. And you're getting the vast majority, if not all of the Latin, understanding it pretty close to perfectly without needing any help, right? That's always the best sign that you're ready to move forward. Okay, so if you haven't done that yet, pause the video, go back and do it on your own, and then come back to the video to kind of double check where you're at. Otherwise, we're going to move forward. I'll assume that you've already kind of worked your way through it, and just use what I'm about to do as a double check against your own work. Not that my translation is ever perfect, but hopefully I can guide you through and make you feel more confident about what you did. Okay? So like I said, in this chapter, Caesar's kind of taking a pause to describe the the style of fighting of war chariots that the British tribes are using, okay? And you see that in the first line. He says, genus hoc est ex aesidis pugnae, right? So this genus, right, this manner is probably a good translation of it. This manner of fighting, right, is from the chariot, right? So he's talking about how you have this method of fighting from a chariot, right? Ex aesidis, right? So he's describing how the Britons fight with their chariots, which is something very different, right? The Romans don't use these; they don't fight on chariots. It's something they probably wouldn't have seen too much, before. So he's going to describe what the method of fighting is, and as we read, think about why he's doing this. Okay. And again, just to give you a little visual, just in case you didn't see it in one of the previous videos, this is kind of what a British war chariot would look like. This is a statue of Boudica, so it's not obviously perfect to what we're doing, but it gives you a sense of that two-horse chariot and having sort of a driver as well as a fighter on it. And it'll help you to have that visual as you go through the rest of the chapter. So you have Primo, per omnes partes perquitant et tela coiciunt atque ipso terrore equorum et strepituritarum ordines plerumque perturbant rather, et cum se inter equitum termas insinuaverunt ex aesidis deciliunt et pedibus proeliantur. Okay, so there's a very long line here, okay, and try to make your pronunciation better than mine. So he starts by talking about Primo at first, okay? So he says, at first, they ride perequitant, right? It means literally, you can see like the word for horse in there, right? Riding a horse, the equi part, and the per meaning like kind of riding through. So they ride through omnes partes, all parts or all directions is kind of one way to think of it. And it's talking about the battlefield, right? So they're driving all over the place from all directions is kind of one way to think of it. And they coiciunt, they throw tela, weapons, right? So these would be probably like javelins, spears, something like that. They might have been shooting bow and arrow, although I'm not sure if Caesar ever mentions that. You can look it up. I'm sure you'll be able to get an answer to that. But they're throwing weapons from the chariot, right? They're fighting from the chariot. Okay, and you have to kind of go down a little bit to see what's going on with the main part of this section. But you want to go to perturbant at the bottom, right? They disturbed or they upset. What did they upset? The ordines, right? Our ranks, right? Meaning the ranks of the soldiers frequently. So they frequently upset our ranks. Okay. Then you have these ablatus here. You have terrore and strepitu, right? So by the terror itself of the horses and the strepitu, the noise of the rotarum, of the wheels. So he's saying what's kind of throwing off the soldiers? Well, you're getting this terrifying sound of horses charging at you, right? So the horses would scare infantry. And that strepitu, that sound of wheels, the rotating wheels, it would make kind of a scary sound effect, obviously. And when you have chariots charging into men, you want to remember the Roman formation is to have these lines of infantry right close together. If you run a chariot at them, that's going to freak anybody out, right? And this is always sort of the advantage you have with cavalry fighting infantry. It always is an advantage to the cavalry. So then you have cum here, right? Now cum is going with the indicative, right? Insinuaverant. So it's not any sort of subjunctive cum clause. It's just functioning basically as an adverb here, right? When is what it's doing. So you're saying, and when, right? Insinuaverant, they had sort of wound, say, themselves, right? So sort of, sometimes you see it in commentaries like insinuated, which I'm not entirely sure is the most helpful of way of translating that verb, but it kind of means like wound into, right? Meaning they kind of intermix with our troops, right? So when they wound themselves among the termas equitum, right? The termas of the cavalry, right? The equitum of the horses. Now, a terma is a TURMA here. It's sort of a specific term. It's talking about a unit of cavalry, right? A troop of cavalry in the Roman army. I think in some commentaries they say it's somewhere around 30 or 40 men, give or take. I might be wrong on the number, but it's talking about the cavalry, right? So the terma there, if you're wondering what it is, it's like a specific military term going with equitum. Okay, so when they sort of had wound themselves or wind themselves, among the cavalry, right? They desiliunt, they jump down ex acidis, right, from the chariots. So once they get inside their sort of the ranks of their enemy, they wind themselves in there. They jump off and they proliant or pedibus, and they fight on foot. Okay, so the cavalry tactic of the British tribes is really interesting. They'll ride in, they'll throw weapons from all directions to cause confusion, and then once they've kind of broken up your ranks and they've worked their way inside your formations, they jump down and attack you. And the idea is they can jump off the chariot to attack you, and if they get in trouble, they can jump back on and run away. So it's a very sort of mobile, lightning fast style of warfare, which would have been different from the Romans, right? They probably hadn't seen this really before, which is why Caesar's describing it. Okay. Then it continues on, and you have aurigae interim paulatim ex prolio excedon atque ita curos conlocant ud si illi a multitudine hostium primantur expeditum ad suos receptum habeant, rather. Okay, so now he mentions the aurigae, which are like the charioteers or the drivers, right? So you have to envision on these chariots, I think you could fit 2 men. I'm not sure if they did any more than that, but you need a driver and a fighter, right? So the driver could obviously fight, but it's much more, it's hard to throw javelins at people when you're also steering horses. So the idea is you would have a driver there to steer while the other guy's, throwing stuff at the enemy. Okay. So meanwhile, right, meanwhile, the charioteers, they gradually excedant, they gradually depart ex prolio from the battle, meaning they back up away from the battle. Okay. And in such a way, right, in such a way they conlocant, they place the curus, the chariots, right? So they back away from the battle and they place the chariots so that, right, you have this ut clause, this result clause going, right? So that if they, illi, right, referring back to the aurigae, if they premantor, if they're pressed by a multitudine hostium, right, by a crowd of enemies. So in other words, if the enemies press up against them and they don't have that space, remember chariots are all a function of having space to operate. If they get pressed, habeant, they might have a receptum expeditum, an unimpeded retreat, right, ad suos, for their men. Okay, so the idea is they back the chariots up, and then if things go really badly, right, they start getting pressed by the enemy, they have a receptum, which again I translate as retreat. Sometimes you see it as like a sort of a recovery. I think it's one way that different commentaries will do it, but it's basically a way out. Okay, so they can have the soldier jump off and fight, and then back the chariot up, and you have this sort of built-in escape route so that you're never stuck, kind of bogged down in a battle. Then it continues on. You have ita mobilitatem equitum stabilitatem peditum in proliis praestant, ac tantum usu quotidiano et exercitatione efficiunt ... Okay, and we'll continue because it is a longer sentence here. Okay. So you have thus, or in this way, praestant, they display the mobilitatem, right, the mobility, equitum of the cavalry, and the stabilitatem, right, the stability, peditum of infantry. So when it says they display or kind of project or show, Caesar's saying they have two different functions here, this style of attack. One, you get that lightning fast mobility of a cavalry charge, but you also get the standing power of an infantry battle, right? So when you think about ancient warfare, cavalry battles, they don't stand still and kind of battle it out. It's all about motion, moving. That can work, but if you run up against a sort of steadfast force of infantry, you're not really going to do great. So being able to hop off the chariot provides that stability, that standing power of being able to stand and fight against infantry, right? So he's showing how this style of war chariot is the best of both worlds, right? And he has in battles, right? So they display in battles both things, the mobility of the cavalry and the stability of infantry, right? And tantum only, right? And they accomplish this only by usu quotidiano, by daily use, and exercitatione, right? And by training, right? Exercise is kind of the idea, but training. So he's saying that they hone these skills because they are constantly practicing them, right? Quotidiano, right? They're daily practicing, they're through use and training, right? So he's sort of admiring the British war chariots here, saying that they're very disciplined, right? He recognizes that. Okay. And then this final sentence continues on, right? So you have, and think of it in terms of the last slide as well, because it's one long sentence. And he says, uti in declivi ac praecipiti loco incitatos equos sustinere et brevi moderari ac flectere et per temonem percurrere et in jugo insistere et se inde incurrus citissime recipere consuerant. Okay, so we have a lot of infinitives happening here, and you'll see why. Okay, so he starts with the uti clause. Now remember, uti here is the alternative of ut, right? So it's just another form of ut. All right. So it's going at the end with this consuerant, right? You have this perfect subjunctive. So you have this idea of so that consuerant. If you go to the very end, they are accustomed. Okay, so when you have that phrase, they're accustomed, you're expecting that they're accustomed to do something, which will be the infinitive in Latin, which is why you see this repetition of infinitive showing what they're accustomed to do. So the first thing that they're able to do is they're accustomed to sustinere, to holding their incitatos equos, their urged on or excited horses, right? Literally, they hold on to their horses, having been kind of urged on, incitatos, okay? And they can hold those horses in declivi ac praecipiti loco, in sloping, declivi, right? Think of decline, in sloping and steep place. So in a sloping and a steep place, praecipiti, right? Think of like the precipice, right? So when they're in really tight spots, they're able to hold on to the horses and steer them, okay? And brevi, which is really sort of short for brevi tempore, so in a short time, you probably want to say, right? To moderare, to restrain, right? And flectere, and to turn, okay? So they're able to hold on to the horses and quickly restrain them and turn them, okay? So not only that, but they can also percurre, they can also run. So again, to kind of take it in pieces, they can hold the horses, they can restrain the horses and turn the horses all at once because they're such skilled cavalrymen, okay? And they themselves are accustomed to run, percurre, per temonem, along the pole, the temo. Okay. Now this is an odd word, and it's a specific word. The temonem, the temo, is this wooden pole. If you think of that image I showed you of Boudica and the chariot, the wooden pole that's attached between the two horses, and it's connecting the horses to the chariot. Okay. So this in Latin is called the temo. So what Caesar's talking about here is the man physically stepping out and running onto that sort of pole, that wooden pole, and you're going to see why in a second. And it says in Yugo insistere, and to stand on the yoke. Okay, there it is. So they go out on that pole and they stand on the yoke, right? The part sort of connecting the horses. So basically, you have this man standing on the harness that's connecting the two horses together, right? Why would you want to do this? Well, I guess it gives you sort of a chance to fight, right? One way of fighting, you climb out and fight from there, right? Kind of an odd thing, but it shows how good they are with their cavalry. Okay, and they're accustomed to say recipere, to retreat, right? Literally to kind of like pull themselves away, retreat themselves, but to retreat. Then in their chariots, right, in curus, kitissime, most swiftly, right? There's a superlative. So when they're out there fighting, they can climb out there. When it's time to go, they're able to very swiftly run away and retreat. So again, this whole section is kind of a fascinating one to look at. There's not a ton going on. And again, it doesn't advance the plot in any way. So we're going to see in a second some questions to think about. One should be, why is he doing this? But it's just a nice way of Caesar diving into the customs, the culture of the British. And a lot of it is observation, right? He's seen them do this, right? One would imagine. But it also sounds like he's talked to them a little bit, right? He's spoken to some local maybe captured soldiers and asked or found out how they do this. When he talks about the daily training, right? How would you possibly know that unless you would ask someone? He has no clue what the British tribes are doing on a daily basis. But somehow he found out, right? So it's sort of half his observations and marveling at how good these soldiers are and appreciating them, and half giving you a little bit of their culture, right? They're bred to be these chariot fighting, these cavalrymen fighting from chariots, and they're practicing all the time, which is what makes them so effective. Okay, so it's just a different kind of interesting chapter to think about. Okay, so here's some questions I asked at the beginning and I'll ask it again now. You want to think about, he's taking time to describe this, so he had to have probably been impressed by it, right? So first of all, why would you even stop to notice it? Well, if you imagine Caesar or Romans watching British soldiers do this, it probably would have been kind of shocking seeing them climbing out on the chariot, jumping off, jumping on. It was very different from the style of fighting the Romans would have been used to. So they're impressed by it, okay? But the other thing you have to think about is he's writing this account, De Bello Gallico, rather, for the Roman people. So why would you include this description? How is it going to help his own status? Imagine if you're a Roman and you're hearing about this. It probably would have been extremely shocking. You can't even imagine what's going on here. You'd hear about chariots and fighting and climbing on the yoke, right? It must have been really shocking. And you have to remember that it all shows or kind of increases the status of Caesar, because these are the people he's fighting and these are the people he's defeating. So the sort of legend grows from, look at the land I went to, right? Britain, which a common Roman probably hadn't even heard of, and look at the people who live here. And I went there, right? I brought my troops there and I defeated them in battle, even though they were doing these crazy tactics. It's just kind of an interesting way to think about the chapter as well. Think a little critically, like why you would include this in the narrative. All right. The other thing to think about, I said it a little bit as we went, but the Roman army was very, very mobile, but it's infantry based, right? So Caesar doesn't, even if he had his cavalry with him, it wouldn't have been really Roman cavalry. He's using auxiliary cavalry, right? From the Gauls, the Germans, wherever we can get it. The Romans are not really known for their cavalry skills. It's the people they fight are, and so they kind of adapt them instead. So this style of warfare would have been a problem for them, right? Not just against the Britons, but anyone was sort of a cavalry heavy tactic or that hit and run tactic. And you'll see this, the example that I always think of that comes to mind is when they go to the east against sort of those eastern kingdoms like Parthia, when you have horse archers. That's always a problem for the Romans, because if you can charge in, fire quickly, run away, right? Infantry is not going to be very good about that. Or against that rather. The Romans are big on infantry warfare, having formations, using those formations to their advantage. That breaks apart when someone's charging at you in a chariot, jumping down, stabbing you, hopping back on the chariot, and running away. That's something they weren't very good at fighting, right? Which is part of probably why Caesar's mentioning here. So you want to think about, as you read it, is there something though that probably would have helped Caesar against these tactics, right? Someone who's not there, it's the cavalry problem again, right? So if you have cavalry-based chariots, having your own cavalry would have been great, and again, Caesar doesn't have it. So you have to remember, in the back of your mind, you should remember that Caesar's sort of logistical mistake from the beginning of this book, or at least the sections we're covering, shows you that not having the cavalry was a massive disadvantage, because he's not able to really counter these chariot attacks, at least not very effectively. Okay, so just things to think about. Hopefully this chapter wasn't too bad for you. It's not particularly difficult in terms of the length. The description is a little tricky just because you're getting sort of weird vocabulary, but you work your way through, memorize the words, and you should be okay. There's not a ton otherwise going on. If you have any questions at all, of course, feel free to put them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help. But otherwise, keep practicing it. And again, you're looking for that point where you can read through this without needing any help, and you're able to understand all, if not pretty close to all of it. That's always the sign that you're ready to move on. Good luck with it.